Today we are continuing to learn what you guys started to cover at last class. We are still in the world of domain and range. Domain is still your x, range is still your y, and today we are still in continuous graphs. Remember, a continuous graph is when there is a line that connects one endpoint or arrow to the other endpoint. So this is called continuous. So last class, all of our continuous graphs had an endpoint on the left and it had an endpoint on the right. But today we are going to look at continuous graphs if there are arrows in my graph. If there's one arrow, if there's two arrows, we need to know how to write the domain and range. So again, we're going to start with domain. So I'm going to begin, just like yesterday, by highlighting the furthest left edge and then the furthest right edge. So domain is still left to right. The x-axis runs from the left side to the right side. Again, we need to figure out which x-axis number does the line cut through. However, today what we're going to see is that if there is an arrow, we are going to leave that spot blank. So if there's an arrow on the left, I'm not going to put a number here because an arrow means it goes on forever and ever and ever. So if we look at our first example here, let's take a look. Okay, so anytime I see the word domain, I write the letter X. Domain is between two numbers. So I look at this, my left side is right here, and my right side is right here. However, what we see is that there is an arrow. What an arrow means is that this left side, it doesn't end there. It's going to continue on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So this graph is going to go forever towards the left, which means that in my little symbols here, the left side, I'm going to keep blank. There is no end point on the left. It's an arrow. It goes on forever and ever and ever and ever. But there is an end point on the right side. On the right side, my x value cuts through the x number of positive 2. So what happens is there was no left border. There was no left endpoint. So I don't need my left symbol. In fact, we can just erase it. So the domain of this graph is that the x's, here's 2, they're all less than the number positive 2. X is less than 2. So now we can write this in words. So my x's, my domain, my x's are less than, This here is a solid circle, so I do need a line below it. So it's less than or equal to, the x's are less than or equal to 2. So my x's, my domain is every number. This symbol is the less than sign. It means it's going all the numbers less than 2. Not too bad. So let's look at the next one. Again, I have a left border and I have a right border. But if I look at my borders, the left side, that's an arrow. It's not an endpoint, so I'm going to erase this line because it doesn't stop on the left. It keeps going forever and ever and ever and ever and ever in that left direction. My right side, also an arrow. So I'm going to erase my border. The right side will continue on forever and ever and ever in the right direction. We said domain is x. It's between two numbers. But if we look at this graph, there was no left end point. It was a left arrow, so it continues to the left. There's no end point to put here. On the right side, also an arrow, no end point, so it would continue on forever. So there's no number here either. So what this means is that the x's are not restricted between two sides. My x's will go forever to the left and forever to the right. So in math, we call that all real numbers. That means my x's will continue to graph all of the numbers towards the left and all of the numbers towards the right. So if you notice, there was no end point on the left, no end point on the right. It's called all real numbers. And we don't even need this notation because there is no end point. So the answer to this one is that my domain is all real numbers. So let's continue that idea on this next page. So in number 1, again, domain is x. X is between. The left side of this is right here. The right side of this is right here. However, the left side is an arrow. It doesn't end. It keeps going towards the left direction. The right side also an arrow. That means it doesn't end. There's no end point, so it keeps going forever to the right. That means that there's no number on the left to plug in because it doesn't stop. It keeps going and going and going and going, graphing forever to the left. There's no end point on the right. It's going to keep going and going and going to the right. So we call that all real numbers. I'm going to abbreviate the word numbers. We don't need this symbol because there were no endpoints. There was no restriction on my domain. It went forever to the left and it went forever to the right. Number 2, domain is x. Domain is the x-axis, which runs from the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph. Once again, left side is an arrow. That means it's going to keep on moving along to the left. Right side, also an arrow. This graph is going to keep on moving towards the right. So my x's have no endpoints. It never ends on the left. It keeps going. It never ends on the right. It keeps going. So if there's no endpoints, my answer is all real numbers. The graph will continue graphing forever, all of the numbers to the left and all of the numbers to the right. We don't need this notation because there are no domain restrictions. Number 3. Again, number 3. Left side, right side. Arrows we circle because that tells us, it's going to keep on going. So I don't need these lines here on the left. An arrow on the right, I circle it. It's going to keep on going forever to the right. Don't need an endpoint. No arrows, no endpoints means that there is no restriction. It just keeps going and going and going and going. Because of this arrow, means it goes on forever. So my x's never stop on the left and they never stop on the right. So my answer again is all real numbers. We don't need this fancy notation because it never has an end point, no restrictions here. So in number 4, though, this one's important. So in number 4, the furthest left edge is right here. The furthest right edge is right here. The left edge does have an endpoint. It stops right there. Notice it's not graphed anywhere to the left at that point. That's my starting point for this graph. But the right side has arrows, which means it's going to go on forever and ever and ever towards the right. So my x is between. The left side of the graph right here, that x value right there is the number 0. The right side goes on forever and ever and ever and ever towards the right. So this does not have an end point, which means that I don't need this symbol. Now, before we can rewrite this, though, we need to remember, if there is an end point or a closed circle on this left side of the graph, we need to make sure that our symbol includes that number. So this here is really important because this here was a closed circle. It was a solid line that went through it, so that has to be there. So now all we need to do is rewrite this with the x in the front. So here's my x, here's my 0. This symbol was pointing at the 0, so I make sure it is still pointing at the 0. We call that x is greater than or equal to 0. At the top of this page, it has a key of what greater than and less than look like. So greater than 0 means that all of my x values live to the right of 0. So what we learned is that with domain, we're looking at x. If the left is an arrow and the right is an arrow, then this graph will go on forever to the left and forever to the right. So we call that all real numbers. But if we have an end point on one of the sides, then we write where the end point is. If we have arrows on the other side, we just leave it blank because it never ends. It goes on forever and ever and ever on the right side. And we just rewrote it with x in front so it looks nice and we can read it as x is greater than or equal to 0. So go ahead and flip to the back and try a few of those. If it has 2 endpoints, left and right, then we'll have 2 numbers. If it has arrows left and right, then we have no numbers because it's all real numbers. There's no restriction on my domain. So go ahead and try the back, and then we have one last thing for today. Okay, so now we are moving in, same idea, range from a continuous graph. So you know that range is the y. Every time we see the word range, we know it's the letter y. And the question is, what if there are arrows with a question that asks for the range? So in this one here, we have the same thing that we did yesterday. The notes are exactly the same. So it says, highlight the bottom edge and then highlight the top edge. The reason why is because range is y. The y-axis runs from the bottom to the top. So I need to see where the graph's lowest number and highest number are. So that's where it says which y-axis numbers does that line cut through. And remember, if there's an arrow, we're going to leave it blank. We'll set it up like this and then fill it in with numbers if there are endpoints, or we'll leave it blank if it's an arrow. So let's look at this first example. Okay, so we said range is y, so I'm going to write y. Y is between 2 numbers, usually. We'll see if that's true. It's a little ugly. There we go. Okay, so range is y, so that means I need to find the lowest y value. Here it is. And then I need to find the highest y value. Here it is. However, the highest y value is an arrow, which means that there is no end point on this graph for the top, which means this graph is going to go forever and ever and ever and ever up. It goes up forever. So we do have a bottom point. The bottom here is the number -2. But the top is going to go up forever and ever and ever. So I'm going to leave this side blank. The bottom is a closed circle, so I'm going to close off that symbol. The top never ends, so I don't need this side. So I can get rid of this symbol. We can even erase it. So this here is the correct answer, but the easiest way to read it is if we have the y in front. So I have a y, and I have a -2. This symbol was pointing towards the -2, so I'm going to rewrite it where it's pointing towards the -2. So this is my answer. The way we read this is that my y values are greater than or equal to -2. That means my y values, here's -2, they are greater than or equal to -2. So we're going to do that same idea again. Range is y. Y-axis checks the bottom number, and then it checks the top number. The bottom is great. It's an endpoint. That's the lowest point on this graph. It doesn't go any lower than right here. But the top is arrows. So this graph is going to go up forever and ever and ever and ever. So when I write it, my range is y. I do have a bottom number. It's a -2. The bottom number will get a line there because it was a solid line. But the top never stops. It goes up forever. So if it goes up forever, there's no stopping number. So we just leave that right side blank. Remember, bottom first and then top. So in this one, I don't need this symbol because there was no restriction at the top. It went up forever and ever and ever. So this is the correct answer. However, we're going to rewrite it so it makes sense. I have a y. I have a -2. This symbol is facing towards the -2, so I need to make sure it's going in the same way. So what this is saying is that all of my y values live above the y value -2. Here's -2. They all live above. In words, that's saying that the range is greater than or equal to, that's what that sign here means, -2. All of my y's live above this point right here. So let's try a couple more of these together, and then we'll try a couple on your own. All right, first one here. Range is y. If you start with that, you can always eliminate answer choices if this was on the STAR test, which it will be every single year. So range is y. When I write the domain and range of a continuous graph, I'm going to put it between two numbers. The first number is the bottom. Here's the bottom of my graph. It's an endpoint. Here's the top, bottom to top. Started at the bottom, and now we're here at the top. But the top is not the top. There are arrows here. So if these are arrows, it means it goes up forever and ever and ever and ever. So there is no restriction on the top. This graph will go up. From here, it'll go up forever. So when I write it down, my range is my y. My lowest y is the number -5. It is a solid line, and so I'm going to put a solid line next to that symbol. The top goes up forever, so I keep it open. There's no number to put there because there is no top. It goes up forever and ever and ever. So I don't need this sign. So when I rewrite it, I'm going to rewrite it as y is greater than or equal to -5, which makes sense. All of my y values are above the number -5. Here's -5. It graphs up. My y values are greater than -5. I'll do one more with you, and then you can try the rest. Again, range is y. Bottom to top. Bottom is an arrow. Uh-oh, that means there is no bottom. So I'm going to erase this line. It goes forever downward. My top is also an arrow, which means it's going to go up forever, which means there's no restriction. It never stops at the top. So this graph is going to go down forever, and it's going to go up forever. So when you have your range is y, there is no number that stops it at the bottom. It goes down forever. There's no number that stops at the top. It goes up forever. So we said that we call that all real numbers. We don't need this restriction because my domain is the bottom all the way down to the top. Go ahead and try the next two examples here. So you are figuring out domain and range. This one is just range, bottom to top. I'll start you on number 3. So here is the bottom. Ooh, they're arrows. Arrows mean they go down forever. This one does have a top. It's right here. That's the number 16. So the bottom goes down forever, but we do have a number on the top. Range is y. The bottom goes down forever, so there's no number right here. The top is the number 16. It's a closed circle, so I'm going to close that symbol. It means it includes the number 16. The bottom goes down forever, so there is no number on this side. So my final answer, y, is already in front. How nice. All of my y values are less than or equal to the number 16. Here's 16. All of the y's live below it. Last but not least, try this one here, bottom to top. Uh-oh, that's an arrow. That's an arrow. So what would your answer be here? So when you're ready, you're going to flip to the back and try some range questions. Range is always looking at the bottom of the graph to the top of the graph. Go ahead and try the back when you're ready.